Let's see if it works this time. Oh, wow. This time it worked perfectly.
Oh,
Usually we have technical problems. Today we're with Professor Blyth, or Mark, and I'm sure everyone already read his Wikipedia page. And surprisingly, your book has a Wikipedia page too.
Because that's totally misleading, but there we go.
Your book has a Wikipedia page too. I'm not sure if you knew it.
Oh, I didn't know that. No, I use Wikipedia for. There's something weird about people who Wikipedia themselves. just no. So please tell me more. I have no idea.
Well, yeah, your book's on Wikipedia. You're the first author we had with a Wikipedia page for his book.
Amazing.
So I'm gonna pass the microphone to you, and there we go.
Okay, I'm gonna put on some lights. Give me a sec. It's not actually dark here. It just looks that way. For some reason, nothing's working. Hold on.
We can see you perfectly. The light's actually pretty good.
It's very dark there. That's a bit better. Now I've got a spot in my head, but no mind. We'll get there. Okay, all right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and have a chat, which is what this is. So what I want to tell you about the book that you haven't gotten reading it. I guess the first thing is sort of its unusual genesis, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, but I think it's worthwhile putting together because it gives you a kind of an insight into how we think in general, Eric and I. This is a true co-production. How did I meet Eric? This is kind of interesting. Before doing this book, I did a book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. And this was at the time 10 years ago when Europe was all a flutter with this incredibly stupid idea that if you cut people's spending in the middle of a recession, somehow that will fill them with confidence and magically cure the recession. And at the time I went, no, it won't. It will just shrink the economy and you'll end up with more debt rather than less. And everyone said, no, you're wrong, because we know. And it turned out I was totally right. But one of the reasons I was right wasn't because I was a genius. It's because I actually went to find these things called bond traders, right? So if you talk to people only inside the university and you've spent 25 years in the university, you kind of know everything they're going to tell you, and you know what their positions are and what they think and all this sort of stuff. And that can be completely divorced from what's actually happening on planet Earth. So I kept reading about these bond market vigilantes that were going to destroy Italy in particular because of its outrageous debt. And I thought, I need to go talk to them. So I had some contacts in these markets, and I ended up meeting one of them who opened some doors to me to meet some more people. But I realized the most effective way for me to do this was to start giving talks at their conferences. Because all these bond traders and hedge fund guys and derivatives managers and all that, they all have their own conferences. The difference between their conferences and my conferences is it costs $5,000 to go to their conference, right? So the only way I was getting in is if I was going to be on the talent side of that and get in and talk, right? And they were quite interested in what I had to say because, you know, everyone was saying, oh, yes, Italy, it's got this huge debt, it's going to die, blah, blah. And I was like, no, this is bullshit. 70% of it is domestically owned. It's good nonsense, right? So I started giving talks. And I discovered that far from being these bloodthirsty bond market vigilantes, most of these people cared about the stability of their investments over the long term and really just took positions to basically safeguard a kind of steady rate of return. Like they wanted to be shock-proof. They weren't out there as shock troops. And that was quite revelatory. And then through this long and circuitous process, I met Eric. And I met Eric when I was giving a talk at the Royal Society in London. And he stood up and asked a question, and we chatted about something. And he said to me, I think you've got, Draghi had just been appointed, speaking of the devil, literally, or depending on your point of view, the savior. Draghi had just been appointed the new head of the ECB. Quantum leap better than Trichet. And I was a little skeptical, though, that he was going to be so transformative. And Eric said to me, yeah, but you know what? If you actually look at his dissertation committee, you understand that this guy's really a Keynesian. I was like, you know who was on his dissertation committee? Who knows that stuff, right? Well, it turns out that like really good fund managers do. So I started talking with Eric and we corresponded, etc. Then we decided we should write a book together because what we both sensed coming, and I did a talk in 2015 that kind of went viral, and one in 2016, 6 months before Trump, that said that Trump was going to get elected at the time that everyone else was laughing. I also got Brexit right months out, all that sort of stuff. And we saw all this coming. And in a sense, we wanted to write a book about the inevitability of this break, right? This rupture, this turning point, whatever you want to call it. Because we basically wanted to write a book that says that populism is structural. If you look at Italy just now, right, in Bologna Book Club, the two largest political parties by some measures in Italy are the Fratelli and the Lega, right? So you've got a soft fascist party and an actual fascist party, right? Which together, coalitionable, basically could be the next government, right? Not anything you want to be happy about. Where did this come from? Because just a few years before the big blow up in the European debt crisis, we were celebrating the great moderation. Everything was fine. Everything was wonderful. Bankers were making tons of money, but ordinary people seemed to be doing fine. They were actually living off of credit, but we'll just put that on a different plate. And everything was fabulous, and technocracy was great, and we didn't need to really worry about things. And then, boom, it all went to hell in a handbasket. And then we compounded it by basically doing austerity for 5 years, in Europe in particular, which produced 40% youth unemployment in Italy and 4 million skilled migrants. I mean, way to go there for how to screw up a country. And that was, repeated around the southern core. Now, there was no need to do this. We've known for 50 years how not to screw up this badly. But for some reason, we decided that we really should screw up this badly. And if you put it that way, it's not really surprising why people don't have any faith in the people running things anymore. So if we put all that together, what does it look like? And it looks like that book. It looks like Angrynomics. And no one why it was dialogues. We did it by default. We wanted to write a book, but neither of us had the time to sit down and actually write a book. And he lived in London, and passing drafts back and forward is just crap. So I arranged to go over for a week, and we basically spoke the whole thing into iPhones. We got a couple of i7s when they came out. I've still got my fine phone. And we basically did a bunch of reading. I gave him 10 things to read for a chapter. He gave me 10 things to read for a chapter. And we just kind of spoke about the ideas in there with an opening question. And that was it. So we then got Surrey to transcribe this stuff. And I got a research assistant to turn it into normal text. And we read it in normal text. It was awful. It was dreadful. It sounded exactly what we didn't want it to be, which is two reasonably well-off, well, one incredibly well-off and one reasonably well-off white guys in their 50s telling the world what's wrong and why they're so clever. Whereas when we put it in the dialogue, it's actually, there's a tension, there's actually debate, there's room for doubt, and it just felt more inclusive and less wonky to do that. This is sort of the type of conversation you could have with a couple of mates in the pub, and that's the way that it really should be. So we put it back in that way, and we had a very good agent who worked for us, taking it around the American publishers, and none of them would touch it. Honestly, on the grounds that the last successful dialogue published was by Plato. So they simply weren't going to go for it. And that was it. So we ended up with our publisher, Agenda, in London, and then Columbia as the agent. And we launched it in the middle of a pandemic, inflected by the largest sort of inflection point in racial dynamics in American, not 50 years of American history. So it wasn't the most auspicious place to launch a book. But nonetheless, we think even to those issues that we really do have something to say about that. The fact that those sentiments and that anger is particularly generated through a racial frame in the United States is really not that much of a surprise. And the fact that it has different inflections in different countries is really not that much of a surprise because they're different countries. But, our starting point was, and I'll shut up here, was if you look over basically the 5 years before we launched the book, you had the beginning of the protest movement in Hong Kong, which is absolutely connected to the struggle for democracy and two systems. But it's also about the fact that mainlanders were buying enormous amounts of real estate and basically pricing the locals out massively, and also taking over their businesses, changing the character of where they lived, etc. All the stuff that would be reflected strangely in the Brexit debate about all those foreigners coming in here and changing British culture, right? If you look at Chile, Chile's in the middle of rewriting its constitution. How did it get to that? Because a 20 cents increase on the subway led to national riots for 4 months where 50 people died. Right? We could go on listing all of the outbursts of Angrynomics around the globe, whether it's the yellow jackets in France essentially being landed with the cost of doing a carbon tax while the rich walk off with the diesel that they power their yachts not being taxed, whereas their little Renault is being taxed. I mean, all this sort of nonsense. And then just a general lack of belief anymore in the technocrats have it. And you see this very much now with COVID. I mean, I deeply regret and think it's deeply wrong that this has infected public health and the attitudes towards vaccines, etc. But when you discredit technocratic governance to the extent that we actually managed to do in the past 10 years, it's really not a surprise that you get those types of reactions. So with that, I will happily discuss anything you want to talk about.
I saw that Andre was moving, but should I ask my question first?
Yeah, go on.
I actually remembered something that I'm not sure if you had written it in your last book, but because I also had read your last book. And in your last book, you had talked about let me just see what I wrote down, a tax, a possible restorative tax, that's what you called it. And you talked about the possibility of taxing the 8% that was the richest 8%, I think it was, about 10%. And could you talk about some other ideas like this that might work with good anger, as you frame it in your new book?
I'll just give you a real world example. I just put together a slide deck for the last class, for my class for this semester, and it's on taxes. And the first slide is the Financial Times yesterday, their headline, Janet Yellen, who used to run the Fed, who now runs the Treasury, who's basically sort of the policy wonk personified, right? Basically saying that we're coming after corporations for taxes. And now why are they doing this? Because even if you believe in MMT, and well, if you really believe in MMT and you think the United States can do it, then taxes are irrelevant. But putting that to one side, you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to pay for this increase in infrastructure. You're going to have to pay for this pandemic relief, all the rest of it. And what we've historically done is not do this stuff, because the only thing we were paying for was bailouts for financial crises, right? And what we've decided to do now is massive investment. And why is the United States and other countries talking about building back better and doing all this investment? Because what we noticed was that underneath all of the growth in assets in the financial sector were the liabilities of the private sector, which was covered over by a tsunami of cheap credit, which people can no longer afford to service, not because interest rates are high, but because their wages stubbornly refuse to grow, at the same time that corporate profits have never been higher. So we went through, particularly in Europe, an exercise where we built the financial sector because you had too big to fail banks, collectively too big to bail the system. In the name of bailing out Greece, you basically bailed out French and German banks. And on the back of that, those budget cuts that were felt in countries that weren't even under Troika programs like Italy and Spain, you basically really pissed off a whole generation of people. And in the United States, what you've done is, it's a common graph that we've seen, and you can see it in many places, that if you basically divide the CPI by wage growth, you've got less in real wages today than you did in 1973. Only you have 2020 costs. So for the very simple one is 50% of the United States earns $20 an hour or less. How are you a superpower when half the labor market's earning less than $20? So what Janet Yellen is basically saying is we need to do something about this, because if we don't do something about this, Trumpism comes back and never goes away. So what's happened is the technocracy has woken up to the fact that a lot of what they've done has caused tremendous damage. And they have about 2 years before the American midterm elections to make a massive difference in the lives of ordinary people, in a sense, to wean them off populism with these programs. And if they do, they might just survive and get away with it. If they don't, then there's deep trouble. So it's, what I wrote in the book about you had to turn towards taxes because austerity didn't work. This is just another variant of the same thing, right? That essentially you're going to have to go there. As John Dillinger, the bank robber, was once asked back in the 1920s, John, why do you keep robbing banks? And his answer was, because that's where the money is. So it used to be that corporations paid 10% of the total tax bill. They now pay 2%. The largest corporations, as we know, pay 0%. It's got to stop. Andre, you up?
Yeah. So since you touched upon, if I can just come in right now, since you touched upon this issue of the recovery, right? Like, first of all, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight, Mark, and I would like to thank Madan as well for inviting me. And my question harkens back more to your book on austerity, right? Because a lot of your research deals with ideational change, right? To Like the fact that ideas shape policy in more fundamental ways than we might realize, right?
Yes.
And what I wanted to discuss is basically your take on the difference in the policy response between the COVID-19 pandemic-induced crisis and the global financial crisis a decade ago, right? So this time around, the pandemic seems to have shifted the discourse away from the deficit politics and excessive concerns about fiscal constraints that define much of the response to the global financial crisis in both the European Union and the United States, albeit more so in the United States, because in the US, you obviously have like Biden's 1.9 trillion relief program and so on. And like basically what in those circumstances, some commentators, and including Adam Tooze recently, have described the Biden stimulus as a sort of dawn of a new economic era, right? A sharp turn away from neoliberalism. And this is my question to you, basically. It's, do you think that the response to the COVID-19 crisis, especially in the US, is a sharp pivot away from austerity politics, from the austerity politics of the global financial crisis and the neoliberalism of the past 4 decades or so?
All right, so let's say, great question. Let's sort of separate out two things. The first one is the COVID response. The second one is this thing called neoliberalism. Now, they're separable but linked. So let's do it this way. If you had said to me that a British government headed by Boris Bloody Johnson, after campaigning on Brexit, the biggest tissue of, how can I put it, fantastic objects ever linked together as a quasi-economic argument, would, rather than throw the unemployed under a bus, would basically pay 80% of everybody's wages for the duration of the pandemic, I would have given you 1,000 to 1 against, and yet they did it, right? So this is the heir of George Osborne. These are the heirs of Margaret Thatcher, who are basically doing a soft version of a universal basic income for as long as it takes, right? That's extraordinary, right? Let's think about the EU response, the Next Gen Fund. So on the one hand, you can look forward to the Cardinals in Karlsruhe basically saying 9, right? But they'll probably get away with it. Macroeconomically, 750 billion. When you look at the grants component, it's about 360. When you divide that amongst all the affected countries, it comes to about 0.7% of GDP for 3 years. It's a macroeconomic drop in the bucket. And it's half of what the EU actually needs, because thanks to these insane, stupid, monolithic fiscal rules that everyone's been following, not just since 2012, since the inception of the 3%, 60%, and the 2 lowest in the system inflation trap, that basically public investment has collapsed. Like, just go look at the budgets, right? Europe stopped doing public investment. This is why when you're in Germany and you're like, you guys want to run a startup culture for, like, you know, high-tech shit, your internet clocks 10 megs. And that's being generous, right? I mean, the infrastructure, dreadful, right? It just simply hasn't invested. Now, the fact that you got the Next Gen is significant, because it is the thin end of the wedge. The fact that the fiscal rules have been suspended is really significant. If the Greens emerge as the dominant party in Germany, who actually are the only ones that come out and go, Schuldenbremsen, bad idea, right? We really need to rethink the whole European project. Wow, we could be in a very different space. Now, let me link this to Adam's point about neoliberalism. The debate over here about the Biden stimulus is very much about whether there's going to be inflation. And that's a proxy fight. And it's a proxy fight for 2 views of the world. One of them has a vertical Nehru. One of them has a long-run Phillips curve that's vertical. So you can spend all you want, but the economy can only give you so many jobs and so much wages, and it's going to show up in prices. And when it does, you'll be sorry, because what happens then is you've just taxed profits and investment, and you'll just end up out in a shittier part of the Phillips curve. Standard story, right? And then there's a new one, which is basically, as someone put it, I forget who it was, why Harvard has not been invited to come down and tell Biden how the economy works. There's a generational shift that's gone on, whereby it's people like Heather Boushey who are now writing policy. And you've got a whole generation of young macroeconomists who are incredibly data-driven, with much better data, who are able to show at a city level and at a whole variety of levels, the Phillips curve, if it existed at all, has been horizontal for years. Now, this accords with common sense. If you go to Britain, Britain's managed to have everything from 2% employment, almost, to 12% unemployment at a more or less constant rate of inflation for the past 30 years. So it really implies that that relationship isn't true. Now, why is this important? This is the core of respectable academic neoliberalism. If you can spend a shit ton of money and increase real wages without producing inflation, it's over for them. If you try and do that and you produce inflation, they win. So we're running a $2 trillion natural experiment to figure out which theory of inflation is right. And that's going to determine the course of whether we say neoliberalism's over or not. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Both sides are partisan. Nobody's looking at this as a neutral experiment. So there's no doubt that because of COVID, because of the Suez Canal getting blocked, because of 2 chip foundries in Taiwan going offline, because nobody runs up inventory in a pandemic, you run it down, that there's lots of supply chain bottlenecks and all the rest of it. And now the economy is coming back really fast, particularly in the US, because of naive confidence as well as vaccines, that there will be a big boom. Now, the Heather Bushes of this planet are like, yeah, this is great because this is going to help us with our project of Bush wages. It'll happen even faster. There'll be no inflation, people will see. Well, what if there's inflation because of those simple bottlenecks and supply side factors? Well, the other side's going to go, see, I told you it was inflation. It's rising. You have to put interest up now. If you don't put up interest rates now, we're all going to die, right? And that's where it is. Now, this is why it becomes very interesting. The Fed has basically said, we're not going to do that. We have a new framework. We're going to overshoot. We're going to see where this goes. So for the first time in a long time, all of the kind of fiscal and monetary forces in the US are allied on one side. They're going to run this experiment and see how far it goes. Are they doing the same thing in Europe? It's hard to tell. A lot of it's contingent. If the Greens win in Germany, a lot of it is contingent. If they do turn on the fiscal, I had a great line for this a couple of months ago, which is, if the fiscal rules come back in and the ECB stops backstopping bond markets and there's a yield spike and Italy gets into trouble, I'm moving to Milan and I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to open up a shirt factory, one color, brown, because you're going to be needing a lot of them, right? And I think that that is basically what has finally entered the Brussels consciousness, that if you go for another round of austerity at this point, you will literally tip the South into fascism. And they're not stupid people, but they have to find a respectable way to back out of all the shit that they've been talking for the past 15 years. So how are you going to do that? You're going to look at the American experiment, cross your fingers and hope it works, because then you'll get to do it too.
Awesome. Thank you very much. You actually anticipated both of my next questions.
Because I broke into your email and I read them. That's why I sound clever.
So you obviously mentioned this big debate in the United States with like the macro wars, as Noah Mitz called them, with Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, John Cochrane on the one side saying the output gap is small, the fiscal multiplier is large. All of this is going to lead to inflation, right? On the other side, people like Claudia Sam, J.W. Mason, Paul Krugman, who basically said, no, in this new environment of low interest rates and low inflation, you have to push fiscal policy, right? There's no hard budget constraint except inflation, essentially. Yeah.
No, but it's particularly if you're a global hegemon and everybody banks and receives dollars, right? Because then you will not have the exchange rate pressure that would come if you're basically printing money, to put it very loosely, right? So there is that kind of big state advantage that the United States has to run this experiment. So yeah, but anyway, please continue.
Yeah, so you have like not necessarily a similar debate, but you do have a big debate in Europe about fiscal rules, right? Where essentially Olivier Blanchard is kind of on the other side of the debate. He's pushing for a huge reform of European fiscal rules, something that like, in my opinion, does not have a lot of policy practicality because it would involve a lot of political capital to change to like fiscal norms as he proposes, right? But what this amounts to, and this is my question, do you think all of those discussions, because those are big discussions in macroeconomic theory, do you think they point towards a paradigm shift in macroeconomic theory, in macroeconomic practice, in both like the practice of economic policymakers in central banks and ministries of finance and academics as well.
So someone whose work I follow on this and I trust on this is Cornel Bahn. So Cornel's a political economist at Copenhagen Business School. And he did some work on the IMF half a decade ago now, which is very illustrative, where he said there has been no paradigm shift, there has been no revolution. But what there has been, and this was the IMF's real role in the sort of the austerity debate, was they just became really good at looking at data. Right? They just basically said, okay, it's fine to have these models, right? But we had these DSGE models that were totally blindsided by the crisis. We have these big theories, right? That don't seem to really work anymore. Why don't we just look at the data, right? So they became very empirical. And if you're empirical, then basically the need to sort of conform to, we must have a Taylor rule, we must follow this inflation rule, et cetera, becomes much less binding. In a sense, what you're doing is you're just following where the data goes. And Cornell's recently done a piece where he talks about, and even people in the commission have picked this up, the idea of a new empiricism, right? That basically what you're doing is you're not really going to pay attention to these grand theories or these models. You're just going to look at where the data is, and you're going to think about what a sensible policy adjustment would be in the light of the data. So is that a paradigm shift? Well, you know, sotto voce, yeah, maybe it's a paradigm shift. It's not like, you know, you've got John Cochrane when he's a young man climbing the towers, or, you know, let's say Bob Lucas basically laughing at people in 1982 who still called themselves Keynesian, right? It's not that type of paradigm shift. But if at the end of the day, the sort of the foundational models and the foundational workhorse models of central banks, etc., really aren't that useful, and you start using other stuff, and that allows you to do and say things that you normally wouldn't be able to do, de facto, is that a paradigm shift? We'll see, right? But there's certainly more flexibility now, and I think that's what it is. I think we're just into a period in which, you know, the only way you can maintain, I mean, the thing about the Blanchard Summers response is Eric, my co-author Eric Lonergan picked up on this, and you can find him on Twitter talking about it extensively, and I think on his blog, The Philosophy of Money, is the false precision, right? Just sort of, well, we know exactly what the output gap is. Well, that depends on how you calculate unemployment. I mean, if you're just looking at the U3 measure, then yeah, that's one output gap. But if we talk about underemployment, if you look at Danny Blanchflower's work on underemployment in Britain and America, that gives you a completely different understanding of the true state of the labour market. Second thing is the institutional variables. Right? We no longer have trade unions. We no longer have cartelized industrial sectors. We no longer have national champions. We don't have any of the stuff that made it possible for labor markets to generate inflation back in the 1970s. So the fact that you have an output gap doesn't automatically translate, even if you've measured it correctly, which you probably haven't. Let's not even mention the fact that 700 million people joined the global workforce over the past 20 years, and that wages have barely budged. I mean, surely that should enter the calculation at some point. How are you going to generate inflation from that basis? Go back to half the US earns $20 an hour or less. So, you know, I think that there's a weird thing going on where on the one hand, it's kind of schizophrenic. There's an appreciation that the big models probably no longer work and should pay more attention to data. But then panic hits in, and what we do is we go back to the old models. Luca,
okay.
What's up? Your turn.
Hi. Hi. Thank you very much for coming, Mark. So I'm sure you heard of Goodhart's theory of a return of inflation due to demographic shift. Before you mentioned how we're basically looking at a real life experiment with the US spending right now, and Europe might follow if it works well in the US. But what if inflation start moving up anyways, like regardless of what countries do? What if it's just a global shift towards a higher inflation regime with the followed by, I mean, due to a demographic shift?
What's the time frame on the Goodheart shift?
20 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How long do we have left to solve climate change before we do irreparable damage to food webs? 10 years. we're really worrying about a 5% increase in a nominal variable on a 20-year basis. Like, that's something to actually worry about in the face of a planetary meltdown because of carbon usage. I mean, I think we really have to think about why we would even consider that worth considering. He may be right. He may be totally right. First of all, demographic projections are way, way, way difficult. Tiny variations in things like, I don't know if you guys know, but you should get this person on, the bioscientist who just did the book on sperm counts catastrophically crashing. By her estimate, right, the modal sperm carrier will have no sperm by 2045. Right? Well, that's going to lead to an enormous demographic shift, but if it's also true, it probably to the complete collapse of several economies, because you'd have no workers left. You'd only have pensioners, right? So, you know, when I see
for the non-economist, could you guys explain why a demographic change would increase inflation? I'm sorry.
Okay, you brought it up. You explain.
All right. So basically now what happened is that in the 90s and the early 2000s, we had a lot of workers entering the world economy. So we had a lot of young Chinese workers who just, and Eastern Europeans, Russians, and so on, who just, due to globalization, entered the global supply chain. And this labor supply increased a lot. And this led to a stagnation of wages and other and low inflation, because basically you have a lot of people producing and very few people consuming, because workers tend to produce more than they consume, and while older people tend to consume more than they spend. More than they produce.
More perniciously, you made lots of labor cheaper because you increased its supply. Right, so that's basically the story. And then just forward this over time, what happens is we already have a demographic sort of decline of Western consumption-driven economies. Italy, the average Italian, I think, is 46 years old. Your average Japanese is 48. Old people, it's impossible to have an increased level of consumption in an aging economy. Right, you just can't do it because you don't have young people coming that will consume more in that part of the life cycle. So if you basically allow attrition on these people, and then you've got basically the cost advantage declining over time, then you will end up with an increase. As a broad macro projection, you know, and putting aside things like whether fertility rates can radically change that or whatever, it's probably true. But, you know, I just come back to this one. We really don't have time to worry about this. Right? We have 10 years to effectively really decarbonize, and which means massive public investment. You can forget the private sector sitting around going ESG, yeah, that's great. Everybody wants to invest in sort of like the one technology that's going to solve it. That's not going to be how it happens. And also, even if you had these critical technologies, as we know from, for example, the developmental states of East Asia, the way that you get this stuff to market is you underwrite the cost of failure for the private sector using the state budget. The state becomes the collective risk taker. And that has to happen. Now, the EU's gone quite far on this, but if you look into the documents for the green transition for the EU, putting aside the amounts and all the rest of it, it's still based upon this absurd moral hazard frame that impermeates everything that they've got, whereby, well, look, if we're going to do a transition, and there's coal mines in Poland, we can't bail out the Polish coal miners because some hedge fund will come in and they'll buy it, knowing that we'll need to pay them out later on. Okay, that's lovely. If you don't bribe those Polish coal miners, they will vote for fascists, and you will not get green anything. So can we just get back to planet Earth now? So to me, it's sort of the Goodheart stuff may be right, but I mean, if I have a choice, here's my thing. I'm now 53. So let's say I'm 75 and say, Mark, you've got two things to worry about when you're 75. A 5% year-on-year inflation in a stable economy, or the complete collapse of industrial society and massive conflict and migration around the world as food webs collapse and biowebs become unsustainable. I think I'll go with the inflation. I think that would be the one I would be perfectly happy to trade off with.
No, fair enough. Thank you very much.
As our last question, I think I'm going to have to go with a very general one. If there were three things you would like all your readers to remember, what would they be? For example, I'm pretty sure one would be climate change, since you've been mentioning it quite a lot. But like, what would they be, just to?
Sure. The first one is, I was asked the other day, when we think about climate change, it was Earth Day, right? Does anyone even remember it's Earth Day? Does Earth remember it's Earth Day? Probably not. What are we not talking about when we talk about climate and Earth Day? And I said, the fact that we're not doing anything. Oh, but we're putting in all these windmills, we're putting on all these renewables, been tremendous progress. Right, but as Adam Tooze pointed out years ago, and anybody who's looked at the carbon hockey stick projections will tell you, the future of the world in terms of carbon has been basically decided in a band from India to northern China, right? That's where all this is going to be set up. It's not about what Europe does. Like if Denmark decarbonizes to zero, bravo, but in global sense, it doesn't mean jack, right? It's nonsense, right? Even if the United States brings back Trump and goes up by 10%, that's bad, but it's not a game changer, right? Given how much is already baked into the cake. So, we delude ourselves in this idea that we're doing tons. And it's like, no, you're not. You've hardly started and time's running out, right? I mean, this is crucially important. What else would I want people to think? Going back to the book, because we didn't really talk about the book, but going back to the book, what would I say the take home in the book is? That basically we've known for years how to basically solve recessions without throwing people under a bus. And in 2010 through 2014, we just decided we'd do it again because it's easier to do that to ordinary people than it is to piss off financial elites. So we did that, and it was a disaster, and it nearly brought Europe to the brink. And as somebody who is a European at heart and by extraction, I actually do think the project is worthwhile, and I do want it to succeed on some level. I hope that what they've learned is that, doing that again is a really bad idea. And I don't think we're going to see that, even if the Germans have their way, which is all driven by the fact that they live off of exports, and that's why they're terrified of anything that basically either mutualizes debt or increases the real effective exchange rate. That's all they really care about. What else is there? I would say the last thing is the three things. I always get stuck on the third one. I think, okay, the third one is this. If you're not careful, and I've said this already, populism is structural. Don't forget that. That at the end of the day, we have unleashed a set of forces that have already undermined at least 30% of the party systems of Europe. Right? If you think about it, the Italian party system 10 years ago looked completely different from this. Right? If you think about France, Macron is the weirdest thing ever. Macron is a centrist populist. Right? He won by being basically a technocratic populist. I don't know how long that trick holds out. I really don't. Right? The German political system, yes, the SPD was declining. The Social Democrats were putting themselves into permanent early retirement by basically just being the helper up of the CDU for the longest period. But now people have lost faith in the CDU. So, what happens there? Well, it could be the Greens become the dominant party, which could be a game changer for everything. But, the key thing is we still have this mean reversion to sort of like, oh, there was a world before 2008, and everything was fine, and a bunch of bad stuff has happened, and we just kind of need to get back. There's no mean reversion in the system. There's only going forward. And all the stuff that we've unleashed in the past 10 years cannot be put back in the box very easily. But we really need to try. And part of that is Biden's stimulus. Part of that is what the EU is doing with fiscal rules. Part of this is this recognition that if you have a pandemic, then it's probably a good idea to just pay people's wages for as long as it takes. And it turns out the bond market will support that. So I'll close with something that's more as a confident thing. I mean, I sound like I'm a depressive, but I'm not, right? I think that the capacity for learning is there and we demonstrate it. It's just that we have a hard time because of our egos walking it back, right? So I think that there's a lot of learning has gone on. And even though, to take an example, the Commission will still, to its dying day, the European Commission will talk about credibility and fiscal rules and the importance of this, that, and the next thing. At the end of the day, they're pragmatists. They're interested in what works. They want to actually stabilize the situation, not make it worse. And, when enough people are on that side of the table, you can get quite a long way.
Thank you so much for your time. It was really amazing.
Only 35 minutes. I thought we had an hour, but that's fine. I'm good.
Oh, sorry. I thought I'd said like 20 minutes. I was actually very grateful for your extra 20 minutes.
Right. You said there was other people watching the stream. Do none of them have a chance to ask a question?
We actually pulled some questions in the beginning, so I could.
Great. If you want to stay on, I'll stay on.
I'll stay on.
Right.
So let me just read one that we didn't do.
I have a university committee meeting after this. Trust me, you guys are way more fun.
So let's see. Well, this is actually on your other book. It's there's one question on your other book, which is the first question, if I may.
Amazing.
So almost 10 years later, do you feel your ideas have been vindicated?
Oh, hell yeah. Exhibit 1, Boris Johnson and COVID. There's nobody is walking around just now talking about expansionary fiscal contractions. Right? Could you imagine actually trying to do this story now, right? Whereby the largest supply and demand shock in human history is an opportunity for people to buoy their expectations for future investment? No. You get to tell that type of story once. And when it crashes and burns, as it absolutely did, then you don't get to do it again. Now, it's not a question of, I was right, whatever, right? The reason I wrote the book is I was furious. There was absolutely no need to do this. And once you begin to understand how the financial plumbing works, right? The importance of collateral for repo markets, how banks borrow short and lend long, why liquidity crunches are incredibly dangerous, why when you're using sovereign bonds as repo collateral and the yields start to go up, the price start to go down, suddenly your highly levered French and German banks are massively in trouble, why basically French banks have 400% of GDP in assets, which are actually liabilities that everybody is promised to pay them back in some shape or form. And then you're told all this stuff that you read in the papers about, these lazy southerners, they borrowed all this money and they spent it on booze, right? Literally, that was what the Dutch finance minister who became the Eurogroup chief said, right? That's an insult to everyone's intelligence, let alone their national pride. Right? I mean, this was just horseshit. You bailed out banks. This is what this was. The Americans bailed out banks. The Europeans bailed out banks. It's just the Europeans lied about bailing out banks. They said they were bailing out Greece. They weren't bailing out Greece. None of the money stayed there. Just round-tripped and went straight back to the lenders. So, I think you get away with that kind of bait and switch once. Don't try it twice, because everybody's watching and everybody's wise to it.
The second question would be, could you give us another example of good anger? Because you talked about, I think it's referring to the good and bad anger part.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a really clear example of this was Cornel West. So when the Black Lives Matter protest broke out in the United States last summer, he went on CNN, and you can get this interview on CNN or on YouTube. You can pull it, just do Cornel West CNN interview, Black Lives Matter, June, you'll get it, right? And basically what he says is, he was asked about sort of the outrage that people are expressing over the death of George Floyd and the other related incidents. And he said something brilliant. He said, what type of society would we be if we were not outraged over these things? And I think that's a really nice way of encapsulating what the positive sense of anger is, right? Anger is inherently a call to action, a call to distress, as well as a threat. If you continue on this path, there will be consequences. But it's also a strong sense of moral indignation, that there is an injustice here which is deep and systemic and flawed, and we've covered it up enough. No longer will we be complicit in doing this, and that brings forth an anger. That's very different from the type of anger which you got at the same time when Trump would go to a good anger example. Walk into Wisconsin in 2016. Wisconsin lost a third of its industry, not to China or Mexico, but to right-to-work states in the South, so states that had no unions. So long before anybody'd seen NAFTA or talked about the WTO, a third of their industry moved basically to get cheap labor in Texas and places like this. And then a huge chunk of it went over the border because of NAFTA. Then there's the effect of 700 million workers, mainly from South Asia and East Asia, joining the global economy. And basically you drive around what used to be some of the most prosperous parts of the United States, and it looks like hell. And then these are the flyover states. So, your Clintons and your other people in the 1990s technocracy, just like whatever, they'll vote for us, they're union guys, right? Trump walks in and just says, you all got screwed by your own corporates. You got screwed by China, moving your corporates, taking them to China. Now you can buy the stuff you used to make at half the price. What do you do for a living, right? whoa, the resonance of that, of finally being recognized that what you've been saying to each other, but totally ignored by the elites, is actually coming out of somebody else's mouth. Wow, that's why he galvanized that he created that social coalition that was so important to him just by that single act of resignation. That's weaponizing that latent anger which is there. The same move, he goes down to Arizona and he gives the speech, I think it was Arizona, maybe in Texas, about the border and the rapists and the murderers and the drug dealers and build a wall, right? And he takes another type of anger, which is based upon not a moral indignation, but basically on an othering, on a completely sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? In a very negative sense of sort of, racial superiority, frankly, of whiteness, and then weaponizing that in the same way. So, good anger is really easy to identify, right? You just, look for it. It's in those first two examples. The bad side there is the latter one. What's really interesting to us, and I think really interesting in general, is the capacity of politicians to weaponize both sides. Right? That's when it becomes politically interesting. It's not the fact that people get angry. People get all angry all the time. It's the type of anger that you can weaponize in politics and move the needle in elections. That's when it becomes fascinating. That's why Macron was so shit scared of the Yellow Jackets. Right? Because that was a deep-seated moral outrage at the hypocrisy of the French elites. And that was deeply threatening to his class and his coalition, which is why he did Le Grand Débat and the whole thing to try and bring this in.
I'm quite shocked that you believe. Well, I'm not sure if I could say you believe, but you say that these movements in even with gerrymandering can be so strong. Like I was reading some data yesterday, and it said that when Barack Obama won, only 9% of Congress actually changed. So the rest seems rather entrenched in, I'm not sure if I could say, I'm just saying that gerrymandering seems really strong, and I'm not sure if this could.
But remember, Thomas Piketty pointed out recently in his last book, just the first 30 pages of the book is a summary of the whole thing. But essentially, over time, elections have been decided by smaller and smaller and smaller margins. So you don't need 9% to move the needle. You need 0.9 in the right place. And that's what the weaponization of anger did for Trump. It's also what they did for Brexit. It's another classic example of that. It's essentially the mobilization of tiny factional minorities on these issues, where anger is a very useful vehicle for getting that going. But the point, to go back to the question we were actually asked, what is an example of good anger? Good anger is essentially the one that is a moral calling out that has a legitimate basis, right? So another example from the United States. Everyone should read Mersha Bahadur's book, The Color of Money, right? It's a fantastic book about basically how African Americans have been absolutely excluded from the foundation right the way through, not just slavery, post-slavery, failure of Reconstruction, the New Deal, from building wealth. They just don't have access to the instruments of wealth building. And that's a fantastic case for reparations and all the rest of it. It's an incredibly powerful argument. It's very hard to see that as an opportunistic argument. Right? That's deeply historically grounded in a sense of wrong, which, if we are honest to anything that we stand for in ourselves as liberal democratic individuals, needs to be recognized and addressed. That is utterly different from Mexicans are all rapists. Right? That's the difference. What's so interesting to me is how both of them can be weaponized in politics and shift those tiny majorities.
I just also wanted to say that Thomas Piketty should be with us in 4 months.
Oh, great. Excellent. I'm doing something at his shop actually in May. Eric and I are going to do something together on his Paris School of Economics talk. So we're going to do on the book. So we're all talking to each other. Excellent.
Yeah, we're in a bubble. As,
exactly. You got one more and then we'll call it quits? Or is it another question?
There is another one, but it's really long.
Give a short version of the long question.
Okay, I'm just going to read it first.
That's fine. It's always good to read the question before you ask it.
It's about Iceland. I'm not so sure why it's about Iceland.
As I start off with an example about Iceland?
Could be. But it says... oh geez, I'm having difficulty reading the writing.
If it's not working out, don't stress on it. We can skip.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for your time, and thank you so much for the extra time you gave us.
Yeah, it's
And have a wonderful meeting, because I guess you have a meeting after this.
I can't wait. We will be discussing such things as MBA enrollments. Wow, it's going to be so
wonderful. And would you give us a suggestion for the next book, perhaps? That's what we ask all our guests.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So a couple of people. Have you got? Let me see. Well, here we are.
Aaron Bennett.
Bennett. Yeah. So basically, why this is interesting, it's another one of long-run predictions. So in one sense, I should shorter. But it's the rebirth of the overaccumulation argument that essentially argues that if you look at manufacturing and employment across the world, it's declining everywhere. And if manufacturing is the one sector that gives quote-unquote good jobs, and it's literally declining everywhere, it's not expanding anywhere, it's expanding from lower and lower peaks, right? Then what does that say about sort of long-run growth and long-run wages and sort of long-run sustainability of capitalism? So, and it's mercifully short.
Oh, wow.
So people will actually read it. That's a really, really good one.
And then you also mentioned another book on population, on demographics and sperm count, I think it was.
Yes, exactly. Now, what's that one? I can't remember what that one's called. You'll if you Google it, you'll find it. She's a bioscientist who first did, about 7 years ago, 10 years ago, she did the first meta-analysis of Western sperm counts and found out they were massively in decline. And she's now done a whole bunch of different experiments and other data analysis to back this up. And it just came out. And basically, it's sort of like we're all dead by 2045. So, there's a happy one.
That's great.
I mean, the upside of her book is funny. When I heard her book being described, I couldn't help myself laughing. And this is sort of the twisted Scotsman in me. I was like, well, we won't have to worry about global warming then.
Oh, we'll all be dead.
We'll all be dead, right? I mean, the planet will heal much faster.
Perhaps I could ask you one last question, because from what you said, all your predictions were right. Your last 4 predictions, I think it was. So do you think Scotland's going to become independent?
It certainly wants to, but here's the issue with it. I'm actually quite supportive of the whole thing because, basically I think that the British growth model is essentially heavily finance-based, based in London, and the whole country lives off of transfers. And that's not sustainable. I mean, if you can do better than that, you should. The problem is, can you do better than that? In theory, yes. Okay, how do you get there? Right. So if it's hard to unpick 30 years of deep economic integration with the EU, and if you look at the most recent British trade figures, even accounting for COVID, right, there's definitely an effect. Is Britain going to survive Brexit? Yes, of course it is. Is it going to harm itself in doing so? Of course it is. Can it get to a better place? Maybe, whatever. The die is set. We'll see where it goes, right? But this is something where you've got a big established economy in 30 years, right? The last time Scotland was independent, the word capitalism hadn't been uttered. Let's put it in that kind of, think about that, right? The last time Scotland was independent, feudalism was the dominant mode of accumulation, and mercantilism was what states did to each other. Scotland has had 300 and God knows how many years. Was it 1707 to 2020? So was that 313 years? Of in deep integration with England, and it turns out that 60% of the Scottish economy basically exports itself to England. So if you think Brexit's good, it was a great piece at the LSE. Some guys at the LSE did a gravity model analysis of this, which is really good and scary, because basically it says, if you think taking 30 years apart is going to be hard, try 300, and that's it. But again, sorry, I'll just rabbit on because I can, but. I was listening to a podcast. It's a great British podcast I like to listen when I'm sitting on a bike, a stationary bike, because it's so boring to sit on a stationary bike. And it's called You're Dead to Me. And they bring on a comedian and a historian, and they talk about different eras and stuff. It's really good. It's a great one. It's an hour long. And they did the early American Republic. And what they pointed out was that economically, the early American Republic was a dumpster fire, right? I mean, it was a total disaster. Like, it took them 100 years in a civil war to get a currency, right? The place was an anarchy. Like, nothing worked. Nobody trusted each other. It was a shit show, right? And that's the United States. And it took it 100 years to figure out what it could possibly be. another 50 years to get its shit in line, and then it became a global superpower, right, with 300 million people. So there's this idea that's sort of like, well, all you need is a currency, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and it'll all be great. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. It's really not. There are real, ask anybody who's been through a divorce. There are massive costs to separation, even if you're the one making the divorce.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that people should get divorced, because sometimes you're in a shitty marriage. There you go. All right. Lovely.
Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day and have a wonderful meeting.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Cheers.
Bye.